Delighted. Obviously, we know that beer, pubs, wider hospitality have been some of the sectors hardest hit during the pandemic and the measures that were necessary to tackle COVID. And the message was clear from those sectors. They couldn't afford an increase in duty. Really pleased the Chancellor's listened, and particularly pleased that he's listened to a campaign I've been fighting for the last 4.5 years to get a new lower rate for draft beer and draft cider. Obviously, the beer and cider that's only really sold in pubs, bars, and restaurants, to make sure that they have a fairer fight when they're competing against cut-price supermarket beer.
In saying that, we're talking about very small sums of money here, 3 pence potentially. It's not going to happen for 18 months. Is it really going to make that much difference?
Well, I think it's a starting point. I mean, obviously, we want to see that differential widen, want to see the tax that's paid on pubs, because we know pubs are really important, not only economically and the jobs that they provide, socially, culturally. They're so important to local community identity as well. And so we want to see all of that added contribution, that reflected in reduced rates of duty and other taxes, so that we're lowering the burden that we're placing on these small businesses in the heart of our communities.
Now, just moving on to kind of universal credit, Labour today pointing out, why would anyone be cheering this tax cut when it comes to universal credit for 2 million people, when actually 5.5 million people have seen a pretty substantial cut? You know, this is £2 billion, but the initial cut, the uplift of universal credit, was £6 billion.
Look, that uplift was always introduced as a temporary measure. We know why it was introduced. It was introduced to align universal credit with statutory sick pay in the early stages of the pandemic, when people were having to isolate, really, because they couldn't be tested, so to make sure they weren't worse off if they needed to claim universal credit rather than statutory sick pay. It was only ever supposed to be a short-term measure. I didn't stand on a manifesto promising to increase universal credit for £1,000. Not even Jeremy Corbyn stood on a manifesto that was intending to increase universal credit by £1,000 across the board. But I think it's really important that we, as people are working, for every hour they work, they should be better off, and they should be keeping as much of the extra money they earn as possible. And obviously we're now letting them keep essentially nearly a quarter more of their money. Instead of 37 pence in the pound, they're keeping 45 pence in the pound of what they earn above the threshold.
Just very finally, I was alluding to there the very fact the Chancellor keeps talking about how he wants to cut taxes and he doesn't like big state and government can't do everything. And yet, when you look at the evidence of what he's done, we're seeing record investments in certain areas, taxes going up. Well, you know, do we believe what Rishi Sunak says? Because the evidence points completely in the other direction.
Well, there's record investments in a lot of the areas that we know are the public priorities. Obviously, we're carrying on delivering on the extra police officers, the extra nurses, the new hospitals, the core public services that everybody says they're priorities. But this budget really takes us back to having some sanity in the public finances. Obviously, we've got the new fiscal charter, 2 really important tests, getting the books back into balance. We've got to confirm we're on target to be doing this over the course of this review, and so I think absolutely we're bringing back stability to the nation's finances, and that's why we can afford to invest in public services.